Hello and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, joined by politics editor Bernard Keane, and today we are reviving a plan to replace the fractured, terminal, increasingly irrelevant Liberal Party with something better, or at least discuss the idea of something better. Bernard, are you ready to get into today's topic?
Absolutely. Good to be with you.
So, 10 years ago, in March 2015, former Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser died, and he was memorialised at that time as one of the great principled leaders of the Liberal Party, even though in his retirement he had become increasingly critical of the direction of the party, particularly the transformation of the Liberals that begun under John Howard. In fact, he had become so disillusioned that he spent his final years working on a plan to start a new party, a truly sort of small L Liberal centre-right party, and he had a working title for that proposal called Renew Australia. The group that was working with Malcolm Fraser on this project published a founding manifesto, and we published that on Crikey shortly after his death in 2015. And while you would expect a sort of political proposal developed over a decade ago to be quite outdated by now, Bernard, when you revisited Fraser's plan this week, you had the realization that it's only become more relevant today. So maybe you can set the scene for us a little bit. What was Fraser's political vision for this country under the idea of Renew Australia Party? And why are you revisiting the idea now after all this time?
Well, a decade ago, the political landscape was very different. Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister. He had won a landslide election in 2013. The wheels were falling off around the time that Malcolm Fraser passed away. We'd had the Knights and Dames and Prince Philip staff and the contest against the empty chair. Things were coming apart, but nonetheless, the Liberals were beginning what would turn out to be three consecutive terms under three different leaders. But nonetheless, the Liberals were in reasonable health, even if that health didn't extend to the mind at the top of the Liberal Party at that time. But nonetheless, there were moderate Liberals who were very unhappy with the direction of the party under Tony Abbott. And that was on top of some much longer term disgruntlement by people from the 1970s and 1980s who believed that the Liberal Party was really, as you said in your introduction, under John Howard had gone in a quite different direction to the party as it was founded in the party of the 60s and the 70s. So, the issue of what do the Liberals stand for? What does it mean to be a Liberal Party in the Australian context? What does the legacy of Robert Menzies and the party that he founded? What does that mean in a very different Australia from the 1940s? All those questions have been dwelt upon by Liberals previously, and a decade later, I think, in a very different political landscape, one that the Liberals really do look as though they are in some sort of existential crisis.
What are some that sort of stick out as the most relevant today to the sort of the challenges that we face now from that manifesto?
I think reading that is to realise that a lot of the issues that are on the agenda today, were on the agenda a decade ago. Issues like housing supply and migration. I mean, the manifesto that Fraser put together is unashamedly, it's not big Australia, but it is pro-immigration. It supports the idea of more immigration, but it recognises that housing people is incredibly important in terms of the policy agenda, and that needs to be addressed. It talks about intergenerational equity, which is something that came out of the productivity roundtable. It talks about having a taxation system that is going to provide enough revenue to fund the kind of spending that the country needs. Now, that is even more relevant now that we're facing a decade of budget deficits than we were in 2015, when it was believed that we were on the way back to budget surplus over the medium term. There are a couple of issues like asylum seekers where it was a big issue a decade ago. It hasn't really been a big issue on in terms of dominating the agenda for a while. Perhaps reflects Fraser's own particular personal strength of conviction on that front. But the biggest issue that I think really resonates now is the fact that it talks about the need for an independent or more independent foreign policy. It talks about how Australia has traditionally looked to first Britain and then the United States in terms of its security, but now that our strategic environment has changed. That statement, our strategic environment has changed, a decade ago, it doesn't even begin to cover it now. I mean, if it was changed back then, it's changed far more radically and fundamentally now. Malcolm Fraser passed away before Donald Trump appeared on the scene, let alone had taken command of the United States and was driving it in a direction that is really, despite all the efforts by the media and by the Albanese government to gloss over, is radically different from the kind of relationship that Australians have long expected with the United States. I reckon resonates all the more watching Anthony Albanese kind of bow and scrape to a president who is, I think, particularly problematic for Australia's interests. Just putting aside whatever people may think of Donald Trump, I think his administration is a significant threat to Australia's national interests. And, Australia has to adjust to a world where the United States is no longer this, relatively benign security guarantor. It's an active threat to our interests. And Malcolm Fraser anticipated that by a decade and more.
I've got it right here, actually.
I hope you haven't used the traditional
I've got
public
this one.
service black highlighter that they use on FOI
No, I've
documents.
gone with a pink highlighter.
Oh yeah.
I've gone with pink highlighter. Yeah, it is very striking. The manifesto says we advocate the benefits of a strategic independent Australia. From federation in 1901, Australia had a sense of strategic dependence on the UK that was transferred to the US during World War II, but many Australians are unaware of the fact that our defence treaty with the US is a commitment to consult, not a guarantee to defend. As you said, Fraser passed away before Donald Trump became president the first time, but even the difference between his first presidency and this second presidency when it comes to how implicated Australia has become with the American defense apparatus, it's all the more stark. It is all the more intertwined, and it has become a far more pressing issue with AUKUS. Not to go too far on sort of the American tangent of this, but it's one of the biggest issues of the day. And none of that was in the picture when this manifesto was developed, but it seems to have just nailed it on the head.
Yeah, look, Malcolm Fraser, in his later years, was a great skeptic of the US alliance, and it's important to remember his background on this issue. So he was Minister for War, not Minister for War. I'm getting Hegsethyian. He was Minister for the Army under the Holt government and then subsequent Liberal governments while Australia was in Vietnam. He later became Minister for Defence while Australia was still in Vietnam. He was an ardent, Cold War supporter of the American alliance. He was quite well disposed toward communist China, as it was then, quite opposed to the Soviet Union, which was, that dominated, the Cold War in terms of, our strategic considerations. So Malcolm Fraser was the skepticism that he had toward the United States was that of someone who had been in the Oval Office, had worked with the Americans as Minister for Defence. He met with President Carter. Fraser was a man who came to his skepticism the hard way. And he's turned out to be absolutely prescient in terms of what I would argue is the collision of interest between Australia and the United States now. Australia is interested in the world addressing climate change. Donald Trump is interested in perpetuating fossil fuels. Australia is interested in a stable, open trading system. Donald Trump is interested basically in chaos and America first. Donald Trump is interested in energy dominance. That is literally in the job description of his energy secretary. Australia is in the business of exporting energy, and we want to continue to be in the business of exporting energy. We certainly don't want to be living in a world where America dominates the agenda when it comes to energy. So there are multiple areas where Australia has interests that are very inconsistent with those of the United States. I haven't even mentioned tariffs. So, the idea that we need to consider our strategic circumstances through the prism of our interests, which would lead us to think that we do need to be more independent, is one that Malcolm Fraser got to, a lot sooner, I think, than a lot of us talking about the issue right now.
The other element of this manifesto that really stood out to me was the post-carbon economy and energy policy ideas. It's very clear that that is the way forward. And I suppose that seems to be positioned as the crux of the fracturing and disintegrating of not just the Liberal Party, but the Liberal Party's alliance with the National Party in the coalition. That's where the spin-off perhaps into a new party that Fraser envisaged would be, the most obvious to us today.
Yeah, look, there's a little bit of history is important on this, because the idea of a carbon price, and the manifesto says we should address the reduction in emissions through a market mechanism, which is a classic Liberal Party position. And people forget that before the climate wars really kicked off, when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, the idea of having a carbon price, a market-based mechanism to reduce emissions, was actually pretty uncontroversial. The Howard government in 2007 went to the 2007 election promising the world's most comprehensive carbon pricing scheme.
Wow, I
Um,
did not know that.
and Tony Abbott was, even after the fall of the Howard government, Tony Abbott had advocated for a carbon pricing mechanism. He actually said, well, actually, a carbon tax would be simpler. He didn't like the complexity. So Tony Abbott, despite having an economics degree, is actually one of the least economically minded prime ministers we've ever had. He thought a carbon pricing mechanism was too complicated. He just preferred a tax. Obviously, he moved on to other positions, and in fact, he ended up holding pretty much every position it's possible to hold on climate action before arriving at relentless opposition. But until that sort of switchover, the idea of the Liberal Party advocating a market mechanism to address this issue of an externality, which is what carbon dioxide emissions are, is straightforward Liberal Party thinking, orthodox conservative economic thinking. As Malcolm Turnbull, used to like to point out, Margaret Thatcher was, a big supporter of early supporter of action on what was then called global warming. So Malcolm Fraser putting forward the idea of let's address the carbon emissions and use a market mechanism. From his perspective, that's actually orthodox liberal thinking, capital L liberal thinking. That's not, a left-wing position. That's not a particularly progressive position. That's just what you do. You use the markets to address these issues. And the overall document says private enterprise should be the driver of growth in the economy. Governments are not very good at running things. Straightforward, orthodox liberal thinking, which is, what you'd expect from, a centre-right party. And yet our politics have become so kind of twisted that not even Labor is game to revisit its own policy of a carbon price. It's become so kind of tarred as some sort of, left-wing policy. It's a testament to how kind of weird climate politics has become, not just in Australia, but around the world. But, to come back to the main point, this is very much the document of a liberal party. Liberal, not in the sense that Americans use the term basically to say you're a raving lefty, but liberal in the traditional sense of believing in individual freedom, believing in free markets, believing that government should keep out of people's lives and get out of the way of business. Pretty straightforward liberalism, and that's really, I think, at the heart of Fraser's kind of vision. Right across a number of issues, whether it's protecting our rights from encroachment by government. He complains about the war on terror and the way that's been used to reduce rights, or the rights of asylum seekers to get a hearing, and his advocacy for the rule of law and free speech. I think people reading this document now, you might be tempted to sort of do a little checkbox exercise and say, well, that's a left-wing position. That's a left-wing position. A lot of this stuff, describing those things as left-wing, reflects the way in which our politics is kind of being twisted. Things that were once orthodox, capital L liberal positions are now kind of seen as, as the ravings of a mad socialist.
You're so right to put it that way. It does, reading through the manifesto, feel like checking off all the various boxes that a certain cohort would say, well, that's woke, that's that's lefty nonsense, which is interesting because trying to place this party in the current context, I found a little bit tricky, because I think a lot of people would say that the Labor Party has shifted into sort of a centre-right position, and that's where it sits in our sort of current political system. Some of the ideas in this manifesto, I can imagine the current Labor Party agreeing with those ideas, even if it's just in principle. Some of the things they're trying to implement via their own policies. If Fraser's Renew Australia had sitting MPs and senators in this current parliament, I did find it a little bit tricky to figure out where I thought that they would sit relative to the current Labor government. Did you have sort of thoughts on where the contrast and where those tensions might be and where they might be aligned?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is, I mean, in many ways, the manifesto is not always, but in many ways, an expression of how Fraser governed himself. So
Mm.
Malcolm Fraser was the man who literally said, "Let them in," when boatloads of Vietnamese refugees showed up without papers in Darwin. Let them in. He literally told Ian McPhee, he's then immigration minister, let them in. This is a man who was bitterly opposed to apartheid, a consequence of his own experience at Oxford in the late 40s and early 50s. And both of those things now, I think, are probably seen as left wing positions. That was the way he governed, which is why it was a very very sort of orthodox economically, but it was also socially quite progressive. This is the guy who set up SBS, for example. He was a big supporter of multiculturalism. But it's important to think what's changed since then, and what's changed since then is the neoliberal kind of revolution in economic policy and the success of neoliberals in imposing, to various degrees, market economics since Fraser governed. And what's happened sort of since then is that there has been a transformation of the political parties. Labor, in its current form, is probably the chief enabler of free market sort of economics. It is interventionist in many areas, but it's quite prepared to kind of take a hands-off approach and to encourage the operation of free markets. Increasingly, the right, despite all the rhetoric about the Liberals being the party of business and markets, increasingly the right has become more interventionist, more hostile to traditional nostrums of neoliberalism, much stronger opposition to immigration. Open borders is a core neoliberal tenet, and the idea that labour as well as capital should be able to move across borders unimpeded, go to where they're needed, is a central tenet of neoliberalism. And yet immigration has become the bête noire for many on the right. Peter Dutton went to the last election promising a truly colossal intervention in terms of nuclear power, spending hundreds of billions of dollars to build a new government-owned power generation system, utterly at odds with liberal orthodoxy. So, our ideological framing has kind of shifted without us being fully aware of it. And the party structures have been kind of twisted around as a result of that. And that leaves moderate liberals who, probably, cling to the ideas of free markets and smaller government and less government intervention. That's left them a little bit adrift. We have got kind of turned around a bit in terms of what we think the parties really should stand for versus what what the label says. There's an increasing tension, I think, between terms like liberal and Labor versus how they would actually govern.
And I guess that, that is part of the reason why this project was being worked on, to re-establish those traditional liberal values separately from the name Liberal Party. Obviously, Fraser was not working on this on his own. There was a group of people who were all united in the idea of advancing this project, including a longtime Labor staffer, Mike Richards, who you spoke to recently about all of this. Did Richards explain to you where this Renew project had got to by the time of Fraser's death, and what happened to it afterwards? Because obviously it didn't come to fruition. So what happened?
So Richards worked very, very closely with Fraser on this project. And he says, some days he would speak to him multiple times a day. He certainly spoke to him multiple times a week. Fraser was focused on this issue right up until his death. His sudden and unexpected death. I mean, he was in his 80s, but I think a lot of people were quite shocked at his passing. He was busy on this project right up until the end. Richards tried to carry it forward. Richards is probably not well known in public discourse now, but he was chief of staff to Simon Crean when Crean was opposition leader, chief of staff to Mark Latham when he was opposition leader. He worked with John Keane, the Victorian Premier, for a long time. That's where he got his start in Labor politics in the 1980s. Bit of a Renaissance man. He's done a whole variety of things. He tried to carry the project forward. Afterwards, he said it sort of limped along. He tried to get a number of other high-profile ex-political figures involved, but there was wasn't much in the way of enthusiasm, and as a result, it folded. Mike put together a much longer version of the manifesto, updated to address the sorts of issues that emerged between 2015 and 2019. Issues like productivity, issues like wage stagnation. They found their way into the document, but as you say, it never really got that kind of backing from high profile people that might have given it a chance to actually get off the ground, because people are always talking about new parties. This idea that you can start afresh and won't have all the problems of existing political parties. Talking like that's slightly diluted, because establishing a political party that's actually going to make a difference is a lot of hard work. You need a lot of people involved. You need a lot of money. You need donors. Clive Palmer spent hundreds of millions of dollars and has got very little to show for his party. He's like the like guy in Life of Brian who says that I know he's the Messiah because I've followed a few. Well, Clive Palmer's tried to set up a few political parties in his time and mostly done his money. So it's hard yakka. Partly because our existing political parties really do have locked in the benefits of incumbency for themselves. We have a political system that really is slanted toward the benefits of the incumbent parties. Where we've seen new developments in terms of political representation has been in the community independent space, which is not a party approach. It's not a partisan approach. It's based on the community sort of saying, these are the issues that are important to us. Who wants to represent the issues that are important to us in Parliament, and then they pick someone. That's a different kind of politics to having a political party with a manifesto where you sign up to the manifesto, and that's I think the big challenge really at the moment is if the Liberals are interested in a new, if there are people within the Liberal Party who are interested in a new party, whether it be right wing or more moderate, how do you make that transition, and how do you address the fact that we do have in some ways a new political model, which is the community independent model? How do you integrate that within a party structure? Because you're talking about a top-down approach and a ground-up approach.
I did think it was interesting that the party structure and that sort of like formal entity that was seen as the necessary thing and the way forward to bring the change to the political landscape that we have, because like a lot of what is talked about in this manifesto is that the quality of political discourse has degraded, and that is causing threats to our democratic systems and process, and that the insertion of a new party that would hold to these values would be part of the solution of fixing that. And the structure of a party itself is kind of the necessary thing. The community independence is showing a different way forward. But I do wonder whether the size of a party structure would be beneficial, and would bring something that the community independent movement can't necessarily execute, because they are individual, because they are siloed, because they are heavily criticized when they do work together. It's well, you're supposed to all be independent. That there should be no coordination and collaboration here. Just wonder if you had any thoughts on that, BK. Is the structure of a party necessary for the kinds of changes that this proposal wanted to achieve?
Yeah, that's probably the most important question in all this. So the challenge for the community independence is, if they want to take the model forward, is how to kind of leverage their power. At the moment, they're kind of relying on what you might call an organic model, which is people look at what's happened in teal electorates and they say, yeah, we'd like to do that. That kind of organic model is, I think, going to take a long time to unfold, because it's 3-year gaps between elections. So what tends to happen, I think, is that, and this is what happened with Nicolette Buller in Bradfield, is you have one crack and you do very well, but you don't win, but that sets you up for the next time. But again, we're talking about a very slow organic process of spreading that model. If you take like a major party model, or at least a party model, and you say we're going to pitch this tent, we're going to invite people to come in, hope that the manifesto is sufficiently attractive that people create momentum from both the top down and from the ground up with some sort of popular enthusiasm, and or you bring in existing MPs who decide, yeah, I'm going to struggle to hold my seat as a Liberal member next time, but if I put out my shingle as a reformed Liberals moderate liberals, whatever you know might want to call them, I might have a greater chance of not having right wing climate deniers and so on dragging down my vote, which has been the fate of a lot of metropolitan MPs. So I guess we're talking about three different models, aren't we? We're talking about an organic model. We're talking about creating a new party from scratch, and possibly we're talking about existing MPs also moving into form a new party, which is some of which we've seen before. Which of those is actually going to yield something meaningful? It might be a combination of all three, but I think we do know that the community independent model is one that's going to take a long time to kind of really shift. I mean, the model was was quite successful in 22 and 25, but in terms of its ability to actually influence policy, well, it went backwards because the Liberals were so poor that they allowed the Labor to rack up a huge majority. So I think the organic process that the community independent model represents is one that's really going to probably take a long time to end up transforming into a substantial movement that could actually wield power, at least in some form, whether it's in a minority government or down the track in a majority party government.
Mm. It almost seems like the last option you mentioned there of existing party members, MPs who've also become disillusioned with what their party is offering, splintering off and forming their new thing, might be able to get up more quickly than forming this very big coalition of individual community independents. But, who has the appetite to do that? How many moderate Liberals are even left in Parliament
Mm.
is
That's
entirely
the big
another
problem.
question. Maybe there's not a lot to work not a lot
They're
to
all
work with.
ex MPs now, so it's there's not too many left to actually make the jump.
The last thing that I wanted to touch on, and we've sort of been dancing around it a little bit, is that there is a section in the manifesto that talks about the specific approach that a new party would take to politics generally. So outside of the policy discussions, it says things like, we welcome the contest of ideas. We want mature and informed discussion based on truth, values, and knowledge. It is imperative to offer genuine leadership that looks to constructive solutions to the challenges rather than cynically seeking partisan advantage by generating fear and uncertainty in the minds of voters. That all sounds great, is great. I think most everyone can agree that's what we would like political parties to do. That's what we would like our politicians to do. But it seemed to me that there is nothing in the manifesto or in any of these plans that addressed the reasons why we don't have constructive and healthy policy-driven political debate today. It didn't seem to have solutions for addressing that really big, arguably the biggest challenge of why things are the way they are right now, other than to say, that they would be the model of how to have that discussion. And it's kind of this principled, like, be the change that you want to see in the system. We will do things the right way, the correct way, and that will inspire everybody else to change around us. I mean, I think you can probably tell by the way that I'm framing this, I was quite skeptical of that. Do you think that Fraser and the people who he was working with really grasped the reasons why political discourse has become so degraded, or is that maybe one of the failings of this project?
I think that, well, the irony is that Malcolm Fraser was saying let's have a high standard of political debate. This is the guy who took the country to the brink of constitutional crisis in December 1975. And some of the rhetoric around that time was pretty heated. Nothing like what we're seeing now, but I can recall as a child seeing Malcolm Fraser standing up at a election rally in 1975 and saying, you cheer if you want Gough Whitlam to get the hell out of Canberra. Pretty strident language
Mm.
for mid 1970s. It does. It look, the whole idea of let's have a kind of gentler debate. It does reflect, I think, a set of values around what should be the nature of civic discourse that I think are now much more contested. I think there are people who say who take the view that the demands that we all be civil to each other in political debate is just a tool of power, and a way of suppressing certain participants. Not sure I necessarily agree with that wholeheartedly, but it's certainly an argument that's been made. But this is a document that probably doesn't really understand or acknowledge the role of social media in the media landscape when it was written, and therefore clearly can't even begin to anticipate where things have gone since that time. I think it was partly in response to Tony Abbott and his style as opposition leader. I got a call from Malcolm Fraser once when we railed at length about Abbott. I mean, he really disliked Tony Abbott, and I think his perception that Abbott was this relentlessly hostile bullshit artist who would say anything as long as he could drag Labor down. That might have been foremost in Fraser's mind when he talked about the need for higher quality debate. But I don't think there's anyone in politics who would disagree that we should all be nicer to each other, and we stand for the contest of ideas, and let a thousand flowers bloom, and they sort of say all that, and then they go into Parliament and rip the hell out of each other. So um,
Exactly.
it's not. I wouldn't have. Look. That said, you don't see too many community independent MPs engaging in the kind of low quality debate that we see from government and see from major party politicians. So maybe we should be not entirely skeptical that better kind of politics is useful. But once you're in power or you're in the contest for power, I think that changes how you see debate. Debate becomes about how to secure power or how to get power. And the contest of ideas is suddenly less important than winning the argument and being seen to win the argument and convincing the people watching on the news for 5 seconds at night that you've won the argument.
Yeah, it did sort of make me think of the clash between David Pocock and Penny Wong in Senate estimates. I think it was last week or the week before, over the sports club lobbying issue. Pocock is one of those community independents who I think really prides himself, and people really respond well to the fact that he, keeps it above board. He doesn't get personal. He is engaging with the ideas. He is asking the questions. He's doing the job that we would like politicians to do. And in that back and forth, Penny Wong, who, I mean, maybe I have the wrong idea of her, but I could also imagine that at times she would say the exact same things. She would quote the lines from this manifesto and say that's how we do politics. But her instinct in that moment was to be very combative with him, get very personal with him, make little jabs. And he was resisting them, I think, as well as he could. But in watching that exchange, it was really obvious how easy it would be to get sucked into that antagonistic style when someone's coming at you, no matter how principled you go into it, thinking that you are, or trying to hold yourself to be. I don't want to be too cynical about it, but yeah,
Oh, look,
it would be a tough environment to hold those principles.
part of the process of of you know part of the challenge of going into politics is if you are actually serious about making a difference, you've got to go through party structures that have a chance of winning office. And that requires compromises across a whole bunch of areas on policy, but also in terms of presentation. People you talk to them privately and they are wise and witty and informed and insightful. And then you put a microphone in front of them and bland as dry as dull as can be as they recite today's talking points. That's just one small example of the extent to which the contest of ideas gives second place to maintaining or pursuing power and being part of the machine that achieves that. You've got to be willing to make some sort of compromise on that front if you actually want to make a difference. It's a trade-off. And Fraser himself, I think, knew this perfectly well. As Mike Richards said, I mean, one of the things that Fraser did was, what he thinks Fraser did was, when he was in the Liberals, he adapted his values to the party. And his values might not have been those completely of the Liberal Party. I think apartheid is one issue where he had much stronger views than a lot of his colleagues in the Liberal Party in the 1950s and 1960s. But that's what you do if you want to make a difference. So it's very much swings and roundabouts when it comes to those sorts of basic compromises about how you do politics and the sorts of things that you want to achieve in politics.
Definitely think, regardless of what your political stance, regardless of how you vote, the manifesto is well worth a read. I'll put the link to the full thing in the episode description. Would love everybody to read it and let us know what you think. Leave a comment, send us an email. BK, you'd love to know what people think of the manifesto, wouldn't you?
I would actually, because, I certainly know the way our crikey readers skew. I don't know how the people who listen to this or watch this skew. It's probably a slightly different audience, but I would be very interested to know just how people label the manifesto. And, given that we do tend to have an older readership and audience, perhaps, a lot of people who remember Fraser,
Mm.
that I think might affect the way people view it as well. I mean, look, personally, um, I'm old enough to to be able to remember the dismissal and Fraser's prime ministership. For my father's generation, my grandfather's generation, they were men of the left, they were trade unionists. Fraser was a figure of hate, absolute hate. And uh, I think it was clear, even when he was prime minister, that hatred was misplaced. The dismissal really hung like a pall over his prime ministership in many ways. And they couldn't, I think, have anticipated the direction that Fraser himself would undergo in terms of his own views, and the way that society and his party, for that matter, would move around him to reframe, just where Fraser might have stood in terms of what you might broadly call progressive or liberal policies. So, very complicated man, complicated legacy, and yeah, have a read of the manifesto and see how those complications strike you.
Please do. That is your homework until next week. Thank you for your time today, BK.
Thanks, Crystal.
If you're listening to us on a podcast app, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Cut Through. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. It all helps Crikey grow and gets our independent journalism out to more people. That's all for now. We'll be back next week.